All right, here we go. Recording has started. So good morning. Thanks for joining us for the first in the Web Accessibility Workshop Series, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and ADA Title II with Sarah McFadden. We're very happy to have all of you here today. I want to remind you about the workshop code of conduct. We're asking that you please do not use any note-taking bots or transcription bots in the session today. We will be, as you heard, recording today. We'll send that out. I've got a link to Sarah's slides if you'd like to follow along that I'm going to drop in the chat as well. So you can open those up, use them as a space to take notes as you're listening today. You are able to turn on live captions if you'd like to. Up in the More section of Teams in the top right corner for most users, if you click on those three dots, you'll see a language and speech option and a space to turn on live captions there if you'd like to have those turned on. And if you are interested in registering for the other workshops in this series, I will drop a link for those, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to get us started.
Thank you so much, Erica. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here this morning. I'm very, very excited to be here and to be talking about web accessibility. I will just a couple things. I'm going to share my slides. I'm also going to turn my camera off because I have a tendency to kind of like lean my forehead into my camera, which is very funny, but it might be like too funny. So I'm just going to turn that off while I'm presenting, but I'll come back for questions. So I'm going to just pop that off and share my slides. All right, so can you just give me an indication that you can all see my slides? Just wave or
I've
perfect.
got
Thank
them.
you. Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, so um, my name is Sarah. I work at the New York State Library, and I work in the Digital Services Unit, which is actually a unit in the research library specifically, but we work across sort of all departments in the library to make sure that users are successful in our digital environments. So we have responsibility for a lot of different platforms. We maintain our website, also LibGuides. We have a lot of responsibility for different communications platforms, like newsletters and social media. And so we spend a lot of time talking about web accessibility and how we can just deliver a better library service digitally. So I'm going to talk about some sort of recent movement in this space, some sort of legislation that you may have heard of. But we're also going to get into what I would consider kind of the more fun part of web accessibility, which is actually improving experiences for users. So this is library websites and the ADA. It Takes 2.1, which, just so you know, this was the inspiration for my title, this 1995 classic, It Takes Two. If you haven't seen it, I mean, if you've seen The Parent Trap, you've seen it, but this is where I got this. And I did just want to share that the review, the Roger Ebert review for this movie called it harmless, which I found very charming. So on that note, here's our agenda for today. So like I said, we're going to kind of start with a timeline. What's been happening, what's been in place, what's kind of gotten us to this moment. And then we're going to look a little bit at just the different components. What is actually going on? What do we need to know? That's going to include Title II of the ADA, which most people are probably familiar with. We're also going to talk about the DOJ rule and something called WCAG 2.1, which is short for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1. After that, we're going to get into some basics, some helpful sort of foundations for thinking about web accessibility. And then we're going to jump right into 5 strategies for right now. So what I always like to do with a workshop like this is make sure that you have something you can leave with and sort of implement right away. So you have your choice of 5 different strategies for today. And of course, at the end, I will share with you some additional resources and tools that will sort of help you kind of take things further after today. All right, so let's start with our timeline. So you probably know we're celebrating 35 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, this year, which is so fantastic. 1990 is when this was signed into law, and that's pretty amazing. What's also amazing, I think, is that just 9 years later, when the web is, you know, in my opinion, still quite young, you have the first sort of iteration of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And what you should know about WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is that it's a very grassroots effort. So it's people from sort of all over the web development space and web design space coming together to kind of decide what are the best practices that create inclusive experiences for all web users. So again, I think 1999 is sort of astonishingly early in the web's history for people to be thinking that way, but it's really encouraging because as you may have noticed, not everyone really thinks about accessibility and implements it as much. It's kind of a cultural issue that we'll come back to. In 2018, version 2.1 of WCAG comes out. So one thing to know about these guidelines is that they're constantly being updated and improved. We know that web technology changes pretty often. Things that we were doing 5 years ago look super different today. So what you'll notice with this effort is that there are constant sort of new releases to take into account new technologies. Last year is when the Department of Justice rule was issued. That's likely what you've heard about. It's not really super new. It's just kind of connecting two existing pieces of information, which again, we'll come back to. But sort of the end of this timeline, or maybe it's just the beginning, is 2026, 2027 is when that rule really takes effect, when library websites need to comply with WCAG 2.1. Okay, so let's break these down just a little bit more. So the first thing that I want to say is the ADA has always said, since 1990, the ADA has always said that library services must be accessible. The only thing that's really changed is sort of how we deliver those library services. And, increasingly we're doing that in sort of digital spaces. So the ADA, ada.gov, is a great website. You can read the language for yourself. It's very powerful, particularly the sections that talk about libraries. You can find that in Title II, state and local governments, and then specifically if you want to read about the web accessibility piece, that's subpart H. Another really important thing to know about the ADA is that the law itself does not contain any of the technical guidance, right? That's really important to know. The technical guidance comes in the form of WCAG, and essentially what the DOJ rule says is in order to comply with the ADA in the year 2026, library web content must comply with version 2.1 of the WCAG guidelines. So that's really just a connecting piece. I do just want to pause here and say that there is a version 2.2, and there's also an upcoming version 3.0, but the law, the ADA compliance level at this point is with version 2.1. The other thing I'll say about that, without going too deep into it, is that it's very easy to figure out what the differences are in the versions. I will just say between version 2.1 and 2.2, the additional sort of criteria, it's only a handful of things. But for today, we're just going to talk about version 2.1. Okay, and the last piece of it is that WCAG piece. So these are the sort of layers of guidance that will actually tell you how to set up digital content so that it complies with the ADA. It's set up in sort of a layered approach, which I really appreciate. And we're going to kind of talk about mostly these top two layers, but I will just go into them a bit. So we're going to, in a few slides, talk about something called the POUR acronym, P-O-U-R, and those are kind of the sturdy foundations of web accessibility. WCAG goes further and provides guidelines, some basic goals for content creators, and it goes sort of even further to provide testable scenarios so that you can do some actual manual testing to determine the accessibility of your content. Depending on how far you want to go or what your particular role is in web accessibility, there are also the sufficient and advisory techniques, two additional layers that kind of let you take your accessibility strategy a little further. Again, kind of depending on where you are. So the reason that I think WCAG works so well is that it absolutely is designed to meet you wherever you are in your accessibility journey. So we're going to start out talking about the foundations in a little bit, but just remember that this is set up to be helpful, and WCAG is the resource you want to look at for the technical guidance. Okay, so we've spend some time kind of sorting out the different components and putting the timeline in order. So what I sort of propose for the next part of our discussion is going into some concepts and strategies, again, that you can take away right now and start implementing to improve accessibility. We're going to identify some specific steps that you can take. And I do just want to mention that we're talking about web accessibility. That's kind of like a helpful term for, like an umbrella term for what we're talking about. The things that we're discussing today are applicable beyond a website, right? So if you have responsibility for a newsletter or even just sending emails to patrons or to coworkers, all of these concepts are going to apply. The goal for this is to kind of just get comfy and get a baseline knowledge set up about web accessibility, identifying the things that we need to be paying attention to, and then of course providing you with tools that will help you take your work a little bit further. This is a part where I do just want to say I am not a lawyer. If I was a lawyer, I'd like to think I would be Ann Kelsey from LA Law. So that's who's on this slide. My expertise is mostly has to do with the web content accessibility guidelines, but I did just want to connect all the dots with the ADA. Okay. So our first acronym, not surprising, we deal with a lot of acronyms in our work, but this is the sort of acronym that you can kind of keep in your pocket to get you in the mindset of thinking about web accessibility. So let's go into it a little bit more. So there's 4 principles here that we're concerned with. The first is that content is perceivable, and we're going to go into kind of what these mean in the next slide. So perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Robust is one of my favorite words. And we'll talk about kind of what that means in this context. So I use this acronym to kind of ask myself a couple questions when it comes to sort of assessing documents for accessibility. So is the content perceivable? Can all users identify all parts of a document, no matter sort of their abilities or what they're using to access that content? Are they able to navigate through all the parts of a document and interact with it? That has to do with it being operable. Is the content understandable to all folks? This one is really interesting to me, and we're going to get to kind of my favorite accessibility topic in a little bit. But content being understandable has to do with it sort of being learnable, right? Which is something that has to do with folks coming to a resource, coming to a website, and being able to kind of get the lay of the land on their own. And then does the content work across browsers and across platforms? That's the question of, is it robust? The goal here is that we have one, let's say, one object that is accessible to all people, not one that works for one audience and another version that works for another audience or another set of users. That's not the goal. So the goal is content that works for everyone, everywhere. Okay. So I'm going to go through sort of 5 different accessibility starting points. This is adapted actually from another resource that I really recommend, and that is linked here. That's actually a resource from UNC Greensboro, and they just provide some entry points into learning different accessibility concepts and implementing them. So I adapted this by removing 2 items and making it only 5, but these are the 5 that I think are sort of immediately relevant and immediately actionable. So we're going to start by talking about text. We will go into color. The 3rd item will be headings and structure, which is my personal favorite. And then we'll wrap it up by talking about hyperlinks and alternative text. This is like, I like to have a little break slide so we can just kind of transition into like the next part of the presentation. I will share with you the last time I did this presentation was in person, and I was using a computer that was pretty old and could not handle this GIF. So it was just like a like a still image, and so I had to act out what was happening in this GIF, like in the front of the room. I'm still deciding if that's a high point or a low point in my library career, but in any case, the GIF works for you all today. Thank you, Jenny. Um, so in any case, we are shifting into the next phase of the presentation, which is a little bit more intense. We're gonna get into the specifics. Okay. So text. We all work with text every day. Like I said, emails. I actually really like talking about emails because it's something we pretty much all do every day, and probably don't really think about how it necessarily impacts other folks. But for this slide, let's keep in mind emails just for now. So your font choice is actually part of your accessibility strategy, right? One thing that we see really often is folks like to have sort of a script-like font, maybe as an email signature, something like that. And I will tell you right now, I love fonts. That's like my, I don't know, like number 2 or number 3 hobby is like downloading fonts and playing with fonts. But when you're working in a digital space, you want to kind of aim for a sans serif font, right? So kind of what I have here, not a lot of decoration on it. Generally speaking, that's sort of the most readable choice for a digital environment. Print environments are a little bit different. But just be mindful of using a font that is easy to read. Text size is also really important, which I'm realizing as I'm like trying to read. I thought it was so fun at the time to make the word size really small, and if my camera was on right now, you would see me leaning like all the way into my monitor to read it. It's very small. So consider making your font bigger. Make your default font bigger. It's probably size 11 or 12 right now. Try a minimum of 14, size 14. This is just a really impactful, easy thing that you can do to make your emails more accessible. Personally, my default font size is size 16, and I quite like it. And again, it's just a low lift that you can do. We tend to use all caps to kind of try to get people's attention, and I support that in certain circumstances, but it is important to know that when you use all caps kind of to emphasize something, some screen readers are going to have a hard time kind of parsing that. They're not going to understand how to read the word. So it's just something to kind of be aware of. If you don't need to use all caps, you might not want to. It can also be difficult for sighted users as well. So just be judicious with your all caps. In libraries, we work with, actually I should say, in libraries and in like government service, we work with a tremendous number of abbreviations and acronyms. That's fine, there's no way around that a lot of the time, but you just want to make sure that you're defining those the first time you use them. That's a big accessibility strategy that has to do with content being understandable. And then the last thing on here I want to talk about is images of text. Okay, so this is really common. You'll see this on social media. I can tell you, you might get emails with sort of just like a JPEG as like a flyer, right? But I want to talk about images of text because it's not the same thing as text, right? This is a meme that I made. I'm not good at memes, but I was told that I did this meme correctly by someone who is good at memes. So images of text. So a meme is actually a really good example, right? You have a picture with sort of a text overlay in it. One thing that's really, really important to know is that this text is actually not going to be picked up by a screen reader, right? It's been flattened into this image and kind of trapped in there. So it's not available to any assistive technology. We are going to come back to the concept of alt text at the end. But this is just something to keep in mind because this is a really popular and mostly effective way to communicate in online spaces. If you're going to use a meme or a JPEG flyer or something like that, you just want to make sure that you're also providing this text in another way. One really good rule of thumb for this is like if you can't select the text with your cursor, with your mouse, a screen reader or other assistive technology is not going to be able to access it. So I would never come here and say like don't use images of text. That's not, I mean, like anyone would listen to me anyway, but this is just something to keep in mind. If you're using something like this on social media, for example, you're going to need to provide a text alternative within that post as well. Okay. Color. This is this one I think is fun, but can also just be like deeply frustrating. Color contrast is a really important part of accessibility, okay? Color contrast has to do with making sure that your text that's in the foreground contrasts sufficiently with the color in the background. And the way that that's measured is in ratios. And that means almost nothing to me. The ratio is not helpful to me. And so I use a contrast checker, and I did include one in the resource list at the end of our session here. So you'll have that, but basically it's just a free browser-based tool where you can plug in different color codes and know if it's WCAG compliant, essentially. Black text on a white background is always going to be compliant. So you have that. It's important to make sure that you're not making things more difficult with your color choices. So there's a saying in web accessibility work, or accessibility work more generally, accessibility is not something we add, it's something we take away. And I love that. I think it's very powerful, but I think it's also just incredibly helpful when we're talking about color contrast because, you know, using like a red font can be difficult for folks who don't see red or green, which is like a very common form of color blindness. So just be mindful of your color contrast and always use a checker, even if you're like pretty sure. Make sure you just check your color codes. Color dependency is kind of a fun one. This has to do with color kind of being the only indicator of meaning in content. So for example, if you had instructions on a web page that said, press the red button, someone who can't see red is not going to be able to make use of that. If you said something like press the red stop button and it said stop on it, that would be compliant and also just a lot more helpful. I just want to go into a little bit more about color dependency because it's especially important when we're using charts and graphs. So I previously had set aside a bunch of time to like make the worst pie chart that I could. And actually Microsoft gave me a default one that was like sufficiently terrible for our purposes. So one thing you might hear me say a lot during this presentation is that Microsoft is not accessibility forward, and that's true. This is, you know, the default pie chart, and it has a lot of problems. So let me talk about that. The pie chart has 4 different segments, and they are color-coded. And there's a key. Ooh, actually, I have a laser pointer. There's a key across the bottom here that says, okay, blue. Dark blue is the first quarter, and orange is the second quarter. So for someone who can't see color, the key is not doing anything, right? So this is a very color-dependent chart. If you wanted to make this more accessible, there are a number of things you could do, but you would want to probably move these labels right onto the segments themselves or sort of next to them and pointing to them so that the color isn't the only indication of what's going on here. Just a couple other little notes about this. These labels are really small and they're in like a gray font by default, which is just not the most readable and not the most accessible. So I think if there's only one thing you take away from this, this is like not a, I don't know, it's not super positive, but you cannot trust Microsoft to take care of accessibility. They certainly market themselves as being accessible and they do have a lot of good tools, but there are a lot of little things like this and a couple other things that we'll talk about later where they're just letting things fall through the cracks a little bit. So a theme I'll repeat a number of times is that accessibility is the work of human intervention. Okay. Ooh, my favorite topic. Okay. Headings and structure. This one really, I'm going to turn my laser pointer off, sorry. Headings and structure really appeals to me as an information professional. I love an outline, and this is basically working with outlines. So we talked about content being understandable, and that has to do with it being learnable. And part of information being learnable is us sort of communicating in our content relationships between information, and we use headings to do that. So you always want to use a heading sort of hierarchy to structure a document. This helps people, again, understand relationships between information, but it's also hugely helpful for navigating that document. And that goes for sort of all users, no matter what they're using to access the content. We're not going to go too into the weeds on this, but I will just sort of talk through how to do this. You're going to use something called the Styles tool in Microsoft, although there's a similar tool in Google Docs as well, and I know some folks are using that. This is a tool that you might not have used before because it's not the best. One thing that I think it's important to acknowledge is that we're all doing things in Microsoft that we sort of they're sort of adaptations to the software not being a good piece of software. So give yourself a break if you if you haven't used the Styles tool, or if you're doing this a completely different way. You're doing that because you adapted to a tool that was not set up well. And I do just want to take a moment here to acknowledge that a lot of this work might sort of present an opportunity where you're sort of rethinking how you've been doing something for a really long time. And I just want to acknowledge how difficult that is. So give yourself a break in terms of, feeling overwhelmed by that. But also I would just recommend kind of leaning into that opportunity to do things a different way. It is, like, I won't sugarcoat it, it can be overwhelming at first if you haven't been doing this work. But once you get into it and start making improvements and finding better ways of doing things, that's actually a pretty addictive feeling. So all that to say, like, be patient with yourself with the Microsoft Styles tool. Generally speaking, you don't want to use bolded text, italics, underlining, or all caps to designate a heading, right? That's just going to present a visual indication, which is not going to be useful to most users. So you want to make sure you're using the headings. And I'll just kind of give you an example of what that looks like. So I just have kind of some sample headings from a fake newsletter. So your title would be sort of your heading 1, right? That's kind of that's like the root of the document. And your major sections, so let's say this newsletter always has a director's message, upcoming programs, new books, and library vote, right? Those are the major sections. Those all get an H2. So, and you can also see that they're kind of nested under the H1. Upcoming programs, we actually break that into 2 sections because it's so large. So that gets another subsection, and they each get an H3. So you can see it's really similar to how you would set up an outline for like a piece of writing. It is just a fantastic way to do a number of things. So one, building in that navigation and those that hierarchy of information, that is helpful for all users. Another thing I want to share with you is that if you're making a pretty large, complex document, if you go to generate a table of contents using the table of contents tool in Microsoft Word or its equivalent, if you have put headings in your document, your work is done. It can generate that table of contents in like 2 seconds. So make sure you're using headings for your users, but also just a good hack for creating accessible publications with a linked table of contents. Your headings are going to do a lot of the heavy lifting there. The other thing I want to say about this is that you don't want to pick a heading. So, okay, when you go into Microsoft and you go into the Styles tool, the styles are kind of preset, and you're probably not going to like them because I'll just be very honest with you, they don't look good. But you don't have to keep them that way. Those are just kind of default settings. My advice to you is don't worry about how they look. Get your structure in there, and then at the very, very end, you can actually just go into the Styles tool, edit a heading style once, and it'll change it for the whole document. So there's lots of really good tips in here just for sort of managing large documents, which we also do here in digital services. So I really recommend kind of making use of the heading structure and making it work for you. I'll share that this was kind of my entry point into accessibility work. I was really interested in this and spent a lot of time sort of remediating older parts of our website. I also just decided to practice this as much as I could. So anytime I opened a Word document, which is like 20 times a day, even if it was just notes for myself, I built this heading structure in. And now I just do it kind of automatically. But that's just a really great way to start doing this. I really do believe a lot of this is kind of muscle memory. If it's not built into your workflow now, it's just a good time to start building it in, start kind of sweating through that process of relearning it a little bit. Okay. Okay, hyperlinks. So this is a huge one. We use links so many times a day as information professionals to share information and to kind of, coordinate work and reach out to folks. One thing that you'll notice. So first, I believe that shame can be a powerful cultural motivator. It hasn't been strong enough in terms of accessibility in our culture, but I just wanted to say that to kind of reiterate, like, no one is doing this perfectly. So if you feel behind, we're all behind. If you go to like even the New York Times and other sort of reputable news websites, they don't do this well, in my opinion. So let me kind of talk through how to do accessible hyperlinks. So there's two parts of a hyperlink, right? There's the text that appears to the user, and there's the URL that's kind of behind it, the address of whatever website or resource you're sharing. The hypertext, the text that appears to the user, should be descriptive, right? So when you are writing text for a link, it should describe what more or less what's going to happen when the user clicks on the link, okay? You don't want to use just the raw URL, though. That's not going to be a good time for anyone. Also, that generally just doesn't look super great, kind of depending on what you're working with. We're going to come back to this idea. You'll see this a lot. Link text that says here or click here. You'll see that a ton, actually, but you want to avoid it if possible. This is just not a helpful way to sort of describe where a link is going to go. The best rule of thumb that I can share is that you want to make sure that your link text makes sense on its own, out of context. And the reason I say that is because one really common way for screen reader users to sort of navigate a web page is to ask the screen reader for a list of links, all the links on the page. And the screen reader is just going to read through that list. If all the links on the page say here or click here, that's all that list is going to read out. It's going to say here, click here, find that here, and it's not great. Same thing with a URL. If you put a URL in there, a screen reader is going to read out every single letter of that URL, which my colleague made a really great recording of this. I actually don't have it with me, but all that to say, you should definitely download a screen reader and try out a lot of your content. Let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. Okay. So the top link here, this is just like a raw URL. This came right from our events calendar. I kind of wish that I had rehearsed like a reenactment of this, but essentially when a screen reader gets to this, it's just going to run through this so fast and no one's going to get any good information from it. Also, it looks horrible. We've improved on it a little bit. In the second example, it says to view upcoming programs, click here, and click here is the only thing that's hyperlinked. It's better than the raw URL, but it's still not telling anyone anything. The example at the bottom is definitely kind of the best, the most accessible. But I do just want to say here that like this isn't a perfect science, right? Like this also takes some practice and kind of figuring out what your strategy is for sort of describing things to your users. So this is just, if this was read out of context, it would say upcoming public programs. And that's enough information for someone to make a decision, an informed decision about clicking on it. Like I said, this requires practice. It requires a lot of sort of fine tuning. And I think this is probably a good place to kind of say like, you won't get it exactly right the first time. We work very hard here at the State Library on accessibility. We don't get it right the first time. We remain very open to feedback. And I think that's sort of the most important part. So also just give yourself a little bit of a break if you don't get it right away. There's going to be a little bit of like intellectual sweating going on here. Like there's some difficult unlearning and learning that might need to be done. Okay. Ooh, alternative text. Okay. So we talked about images of text before, and I'm just going to expand on that a little bit. So anytime you include an image in an email, in a newsletter, on a web page, or on social media, just to name a few, you want to make sure you're including a description via alternative text or alt text. Okay, so when a screen reader encounters an image, it's going to announce that there's an image, and then right after that, it will read the description that you've provided. If you didn't provide an alt text description, a user employing a screen reader is going to hear that there's an image, and then the screen reader is going to move on. So they're going to know there's an image, they're not going to know what it is, and that is a bad user experience. So you want to make sure you're describing the image. Now, alt text is not visible in your document, although there are other strategies like sort of captions where it would be visible. Alt text is not visible on your web page or in your document. It just gets read out to screen readers that are accessing the image. Your description in your alt text is going to depend a lot on the image's purpose, so why you chose it in the first place. You know, ideally, like we're choosing images that are illustrating a point that we're trying to make or a concept that we're trying to explain. So the way you write your alt text is really going to depend on why you chose that image and sort of what is in that image that's important for people to pay attention to. There are also instances where you might want to mark something as decorative. And like this is something that's really handy in slide presentations, like in PowerPoint. If you have something like a horizontal line that kind of appears to like, you know, break up text, or you have slides where your library's logo is appearing like on every page, there are some instances where you might actually want to hide those items from a screen reader, especially if those items being announced is going to be too disruptive or break up the flow of the other content. There are some competing schools of thought here, and I am still thinking about this, and I would encourage everybody to think about it. There's an argument to be made for sort of communicating all aspects, all visual aspects of a document. So, you know, making sure everyone has the opportunity to sort of experience the decorative elements as well. You can decide how you want to do that. Again, it's important to make sure that you're doing manual testing and really experiencing this the way that other users might experience it. The other thing about alt text is like it's a little bit of a balancing act. You want to be complete in what you're communicating, but you want to try to be concise as well. So there's an extent to which alternative text and decorative images and conciseness all has to do with kind of the larger flow of the content. And we are going to look at an example next. And then just another reminder not to trust the automated checker here. I'm just going to talk about PowerPoint briefly because this is where I experience this the most. Microsoft will generate some alt text for you when you put an image in a document. Microsoft has, every time I have inserted an image into a PowerPoint, Microsoft has tried to tell me that it's a picture of a sandwich. Do I wish that was the case? Yes. I wish I was making PowerPoints about sandwiches all the time. Remind me to talk about that again at the end. But all that to say, like, you can't trust the AI generated alt text that it's creating. And like I said earlier, it's really just checking for the presence or absence of alt text. It's not checking to see if it makes sense. So please don't rely on Microsoft's AI to determine if the alt text is good. So let's actually work through that a little bit. I've been torturing my colleagues at the New York State Library with this joke for like years, but I love it and I'll never give it up. We have two photographs here of a flock of seagulls, right? Image on the left is a flock of actual seagulls taking off over like some ocean water. And then the image on the right is the band, a flock of seagulls. This joke never stops being funny for me. Obviously, in one sense, you can say, well, they're both pictures of a flock of seagulls, but if we dig in a little bit more, not just to the images themselves, but why we're using them, we can have an easier time kind of picking out the details that we want. So this is fun for me. I kind of like to make up like fake scenarios for these images. So for the image on the left, which is an image of like actual birds, if this photo was included in the newsletter of like a bird watching society, it would probably pick out specifics about the appearance of the birds, right? They have sort of black tips on their wings and on their faces. It might kind of talk about their habitat. What I always think about with this picture is like, if you were using it in like a newsletter for your municipal park to like warn people that like roving flocks of seagulls were stealing French fries, you might say like, you know, in this part of the park at such and such beach, like don't leave your French fries unattended because there's these seagulls. I have a very vivid imagination. Not really, that's like something that happens everywhere. There are seagulls. If you were writing about, well, I don't know what you'd be writing about necessarily, but if you were talking about the other image of the band, a flock of seagulls, there's a lot of different things to pick out. These images could not be more different. You might be writing about 80s culture and fashion. There's certainly a lot of descriptors for these clothes and these hairstyles. If you're writing about, you know, just music from the 80s and like promotional art from the 80s, you could point out that they're on like a weird purple atmospheric planet. So it's really just getting to the bottom of what you're trying to share, and then writing a description that pulls out those details. So I do want to give you the opportunity, if you would like to put into the chat a description of, let me get my laser pointer back out, this hairstyle in the middle here. The last time I asked for audience participation, I got some really beautiful descriptions of this person's hairstyle. So if anyone would like to, let's imagine that we are writing about 80s hairstyles. How would you describe this? And then I'll share with you an answer that someone gave that I really liked. Okay, I'm just gonna look at the chat. Dangerous for me to look at the chat, but Chewbacca. Yeah. Blonde. Oh, wow. Okay, okay. Again, depending on what you're trying to kind of communicate, that would inform your, okay, floppy mohawk, that would inform your approach a little bit. These are all really good. Someone, the last time I asked this, someone described this as like, this hairstyle is like an ocean wave cresting and then falling. It was very beautiful. I should have written it down, but all that to say, bangs with wings. Oh my gosh, you all are doing amazing at this. Okay, I'm not worried about you at all. So all this to say that like, this should work for you and it can be fun also. But you just want to make sure that if there's information, sorry, I'm still reading all of your descriptions of this hairstyle and I really appreciate them. Sorry, that totally made me lose my train of thought. Just make sure that you are communicating all the information that you're trying to share. Make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to access that information. That's really the most important thing. So, like I said, these apply to everything. So if you work on web pages or LibGuides, shout out to SpringShare, by the way. They're very accessibility forward and I appreciate them. If you deal with documents, Word documents that eventually become PDFs, if you have any responsibility for online calendars or registration forms or feedback forms, these principles all apply to these things. We talked about newsletters and emails a little bit, and of course flyers that you're sharing, you know, to be shared like online, and stuff that needs to be printed out too. Some of those accessibility considerations are a little bit different, but things like color contrast and text size, that all is going to hold true. All right, as promised, I have some tools for you, tools and resources. Here's the contrast checker right up top. Super recommend it. throw a bookmark on there. Just a great free tool. The Wave checker, next one down here, another free web-based tool. You can drop in the URL for a website. It can be your website or anybody's website, and it'll give you a quick breakdown of the accessibility concerns, if there are any, and also just kind of the structural elements of the page. So that's a fun way to spy on a website or to check your own. The Cooper-Hewitt guidelines for image description. This is possibly my favorite resource that I share with folks. There's great information in here about when you're writing alt text, like how to describe people, how to describe different sort of media and formats. And I think one of the most useful things is actually just the wealth of examples of alt text that are included in the site. So definitely check that out if you're doing anything with alt text or if you're just curious. If you're looking for a free screen reader, NV Access makes the NVDA screen reader. This is what a lot of us here at the State Library have on our machines. Great help resources, really great piece of software. I can't stress enough how important it is to test things yourself and not trust automated checkers. I will share with you, this has been a real learning curve for me. The screen reader is, it's taking me a while to learn it, but it's just really valuable to be able to have this to really thoroughly test content. Okay, and just some additional learning if you're interested. W3.org is kind of a one-stop shop for standards and guidelines and learning resources. We've started publishing monthly accessibility tips on the New York State Library blog. You can find that right on our homepage under news and announcements. And we have a lot of other really exciting things on our blog. I did mention sandwiches before. I actually just wrote a blog post all about sandwiches with items from our collections in the research library, so make sure you check that out. There's other stuff too, not just sandwiches. And then the ADA website does have a good sort of first steps document to help people kind of get ready for complying with Title II. So that is everything for me. I am ready for your questions. You have been a wonderful audience so far. I'm going to stop my share and let's get to those questions.
Sarah, I'm going to post a couple in the chat for you that are from further up.
Okay.
Got the first two are there now. I can read them for you too, if that'd be helpful.
Okay, all right, I see him. Okay, so first one is, what about for documents that are meant to be printed? Text description becomes useless without the URL. Yeah, great question. I can tell you what we do here at the State Library. For items that include a link, but are also meant to be printed, or maybe it's kind of a both situation, we've been putting the descriptive hyperlink in there as usual, and then putting the URL unlinked in parentheses afterwards. It's been going okay. It's difficult with certain long URLs, but when you're kind of trying to balance like online use, like digital use and print use, that's kind of the best way to split the difference. Okay, other question. What's your advice for getting folks to notice linked text without saying click here? I've noticed that quite a few individuals will completely miss a link. Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, have gotten this question before, and I really, really appreciate this because this means you're really paying attention to your users, right? And that's very, very important. A couple things. I think part of it is maybe sort of how you're formatting it. So one thing I actually didn't mention, and this is not me trying to be like, you're doing this wrong. This is just me suggesting maybe some ways to call attention to links. One thing I didn't mention is that, generally speaking, you'd never want to underline anything that isn't a link, right? So when we talk about, creating headings and not using like all caps and bold, like you don't want to use underlining either. Gets tough when we're talking about books sometimes, but links are really the only thing that should be underlined. So I think that there are things that you can do to kind of like pump that up a little bit. Sometimes I make links really bold, I make them really big, and I try to make sure that the copy around the link is sort of guiding maybe how people are navigating that. That being said, like if you have a group where you know you need to kind of take a different approach, I think that's okay too. I think fine-tuning it to your audience, as long as you're not excluding anybody, I think that's okay. Okay. All right, just let me know if I miss anything.
Yeah, so Katie came in with a question. How well do footnotes work in an accessible document? Would that be a solution for URLs?
It really depends. Um, it really depends. It might be a good solution. So I will say, we didn't really talk about PDFs very much, because it's very complicated. You absolutely could do footnotes. You just would have to, you're just introducing sort of an extra element where you're going to have to make sure that your footnotes are also accessible. So, in a PDF, when you're sharing like a PDF with folks, that's a little bit of a process. It's not to say that you shouldn't use them. It's just make sure you plan for that too. But yeah, that could be a great solution for URLs.
This goes back to alt text and I think the sandwiches from Microsoft. Are there any recommendations for testing checkers?
Yeah, nothing. So I don't have any recommendations for testing the checkers themselves. I really just, my recommendation is to just be like suspicious of them. Um, Usually there's a question kind of comes up about like AI tools for this too. And I know we've all seen AI tools like doing a really good job with certain tasks, but to kind of like extend the conversation from the previous question, like this just has to be a human-centered thing. Um, the checkers are really helpful. You should obviously still use them, let them be a tool. They just can't ever be the deciding factor, right? So determining the accessibility of something is always going to be a solely human endeavor.
This question comes from Michael. It's a crazy question. Maybe I lost something. How can someone blind know what a visual image looks like? And this goes back to the alt text conversation as well.
Yeah. So yeah, you have a lot of different opportunities to provide that information. So alt text is like the standard way that we do that, and it is important to include alt text. So that alt text is going to, no matter what the image is, if it's a photograph, an illustration, a map, if it's a pie chart or a graph, you need to describe what is being communicated in that. And again, it's like a balance between like being very complete and being very concise. It's pulling out the main ideas. You don't necessarily want to describe every single thing in certain images. So again, I really recommend that Cooper Hewitt resource just for examples of what really successful alt text looks like. The other thing I just want to mention, if you're feeling overwhelmed about alt text, and like I had a number of like face down on my desk moments with it this week, um, there's a really great article from a couple years ago. It was a Washington Post article about some satellite images of like space that had been released. And the article specifically was about the team that wrote the alt text to describe outer space, pictures of outer space. I like to think about that because if people can describe like a galaxy, I feel like I can probably describe like a picture of my library or a picture of a pie chart. So it is work, and it is practice.
Chris asked, why not hyperlink the entire sentence? Click here for blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, you can. You can do that, and if it works well for your users and your process, you can. Um, I just find it a little, I don't know, that's a little clunky to me, but again, if it works for you and your users, technically that is accessible and it is compliant.
Ryan asked, as for long URLs on printed items, how are QR codes viewed in accessibility terms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've not specifically had this question, but I think I can speak to it a little bit. So QR codes are actually a great accessibility tool. And I'm going to speak like a little bit out of turn, but I will share with you actually. So if you were here for our accessibility conference a couple months ago, you may have gone to a museum exhibit here. It's the Mary Banning World of Mushrooms. It's been designed to be inclusive. So it has a lot of tactile elements for folks who may not be sighted, but it also has scannable QR codes for some of the panel text, so that folks who may have a visual impairment, they can get an accessible electronic version on their phone so that they still have access to the information, and then they also have it to sort of consume and go through and process like on their own time. So essentially, like with a printed item, you know, an electronic version that's like fully tagged and has been fully set up is always going to be the most accessible option. So sometimes it's just about kind of having both available. And a QR code is a good way to do that.
Thank you. Jennifer asked if all PDF documents should be created into an HTML file. She said she was advised to do that in another webinar.
Yeah, so I think this is about like using HTML like instead of a PDF. HTML, generally speaking, it's much easier to make it fully accessible. PDFs are tough though, like we all deal with them because we all have to, and we all have to deal with Adobe, unfortunately. So it depends. PDFs are really good for sort of a snapshot of something, so a report or something that kind of has a limited, the information might have like a more limited shelf life. We like to use PDFs for that. It takes a lot more time to make a PDF accessible, and it has to start with designing that source file. If you are a heavy Canva user and you're using PDFs to create Canva, you might be having a bad time right now. And so the path is really like starting with a very, very accessible source file, ideally a Word document, as terrible as Word is, and then going to PDF. Sometimes you don't even need a PDF. Sometimes we're all like a little conditioned to make a PDF and we don't need to. So again, it's kind of weighing out like what is going to work best for your users. But yeah, generally speaking, like the easiest thing to make accessible is HTML.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll also point out that Sarah's next workshop is on creating accessible documents in PDFs. So if you want to check that out, I'll drop the links again to register for those. I think we have time to get through these last two questions.
Okay.
You mentioned that sans serif is best for digital environments, but that print environments are a little different. Can you say more about fonts and print environments?
Sure, yeah. I don't have a ton of expertise on this, but I have read a few sort of studies. Generally speaking, serif fonts are helpful for folks in like a print reading environment. I don't have any sort of information about like how much better that experience is. But yeah, you have a little more flexibility to work with serif fonts in a print environment.
Thanks, Sarah. Stephanie says, we use Constant Contact for email marketing and newsletter. It does not handle alt text well. Any other products that do it better?
We also use Constant Contact. Yeah, so what I'll say about this is that you might just need to develop like a workaround, because my opinion is that none of these platforms really do it well. Not to say that like, I mean, maybe there's another one that does do it better than Constant Contact. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But my experience is that like literally nothing works well. Even social media, like you can't even really always do alt text in the way that you want to do it. So it might just be about, you know, if you're not happy with the way it's handling alt text, maybe it's about shifting to like in-text descriptions, which is also okay, and just kind of experimenting with it that way. But like I share your frustrations with Constant Contact, so I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, Sarah. I want to be mindful of everyone's time as we're coming up at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us today. I did drop the links to the next two workshops in the chat. If you're interested, please register for those. The recording and Sarah's slides will come out via email as soon as we wrap up here today. Thanks so much. And thank you, Sarah, for being here. We are grateful to you and your expertise. Thanks. Bye all.